Production support for Agnes, the Flood of '72, has been provided by the Corning Incorporated Foundation, the Community Foundation of Elmira Corning and the Finger Lakes, and by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.
It began quietly on June 11th, with a cluster of thunderstorms moving north up the Pacific coast of South America. The storms, like so many before, would likely have rained themselves out over the Gulf of Mexico. But fate was about to dramatically change their destiny. On June 14th, an atmospheric phenomenon known as a polar front collided with the storms over Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. By the end of the day, the storms had strengthened dramatically, giving birth to a tropical depression that began to drift out over the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea. By Friday the 16th, strong winds and heavy rains were already lashing the western edge of Cuba. Tropical storm warnings were posted for the Bahamas. The next day, the warnings had changed. The storm was now a hurricane. Her name was Agnes, and she was headed for the Florida coast.
I think the stories that you would reflect on from being a boy about the fire department, the police department is that they were always there. If there was a need, regardless of the need in the community, they were always there. So that was probably the big reason that I joined the fire department in '71. They were a good group of guys, most all the same age. You did things together. You know, softball, baseball, so you were doing things together. It was your second family. That's what the fire service or the fire department ended up to be for all of us.
It was a dairy town, rural town. There was Dan's Dairy, which was a large dairy in Gang Mills, and Scudder's Dairy on Canada Road. Of course, there was wasn't a lot of retail. There was a couple of diners and a small store.
I guess I remember going shopping in Painted Post as a young boy. I remember the freedoms we had. We got home from school, got on the bike, went to play with our friends. Home by supper. You know, you didn't have to worry about being out and about. So it was everybody knew everybody, and that's the way it was.
Saturday, June 17th, was a warm and sun-filled day in the southern tier of New York. It would be the last sunny day for a while. A low-pressure system from Canada was bringing clouds and rain for the next several days, nothing uncommon for the beginning of summer. The tiny hamlet of Gang Mills lay 30 miles southeast of Keuka Lake, in the Finger Lakes region of New York, just west of the village of Painted Post. For its all-volunteer fire department, the day was business as usual. Beyond a small grease fire at the local diner and a smoldering pile of leaves near the school, the weekend had been appreciatively quiet. There was little attention paid to the hurricane now spinning toward Florida, 1,300 miles away. As had become routine, the younger firefighters spent much of their weekend running training drills under the department's veteran leadership.
Well, I was a firefighter, but the chief was Jack Keenley, and first assistant chief was Hobart Abbey.
Hobie was a great leader with a lot of experience, and you could tell from Hobie that he wanted to make sure that you were benefit of his experiences. I remember Hobie is probably one of the best as far as sharing those experiences so that you could learn.
Although largely unspoken, every member of the department shared the same underlying concern: the uncontrollable and potentially destructive nature of the waters that surrounded their community.
As kids, we fished and swam in the rivers. Back then, your parents didn't worry about you if you weren't home, late in the afternoon, because you were gone from morning till night usually. So the rivers were, back then, were a pretty big recreation source.
The river was a lot of trees, a lot of woods along the river. We were there constantly growing up, winter, summer. That was probably a big part. The water was a big part of our life.
In the history of the area, there was a flood in '35 that was fairly large. We had a lot of high water, but it was always affected the lowland areas.
There was dikes, there was some flood protection that was along the Chemung and along the Cohocton. So there was some protection, but there was still always a way for the water to come into the neighborhoods. We were always aware that the river could be a little uncontrollable, and you learn to respect that.
I officially was the first employee of the Corning Museum of Glass. So I went up, and there was an empty office, and there was wooden shelving on the walls. And I sat down at this empty desk, and Miss Hessinger came in. She was the controller for Steuben. And she put a passbook on the desk to the Bowery Savings Bank. And she said, "There's the money. You're supposed to fill the shelves." And that was it. That's where it started.
By the spring of 1972, the collection that Thomas Buechner had helped assemble had grown into one of the most remarkable museums in America, housing over 13,000 glass artifacts and an unrivaled library of rare books and photographs, chronicling the history and science of glassmaking. There was no better place in America for a museum dedicated to the art of glassmaking than Corning, New York. Since 1869, Corning had worked hard to earn its reputation as the Crystal City, the United States' premier manufacturer of glass and the technology built from it. Corning rested just 3 miles east of Gang Mills and Painted Post. The Chemung River sliced directly through the center of the compact but bustling city. Corning shared with its neighbors the same series of Depression-era levees and dams that they believed protected their city's economic heart along Market Street. It was there, even late into the century, that Corning continued to exhibit the characteristics of its industrial heritage.
Market Street was a really very simple street with a lot of long underwear stores and 5 and 10 cent stores and bars. It had a great many bars.
Market Street in Corning was a kind of dirty, working class, gritty place. There were a lot of bars on Market Street. Even in 1972, people would get out for lunch from the factory. They would actually leave the plant, come out onto Market Street for lunch, and at lunch they would have beer. I mean, they wouldn't just eat lunch, they would, have a couple of beers, and then they'd go back into the plant. And that was just the way life was.
But by the summer of 1972, a grassroots movement was already in place to study Market Street's architecture and lay plans for a new life.
It was clear that something had to happen with Market Street, that we had all this kind of derelict property on it, and that it was a mess, and I think it was about 50% vacant.
We wanted it to be pretty. We wanted our kids to grow up so that they could look around and have an appreciation of things that were meaningful and attractive. And we thought that the main street was meaningful and could be made attractive.
Corning, New York, a city of 17,000 people in the beautiful Finger Lakes country. Flag Day, 1972.
The same week that Hurricane Agnes began its trek toward the United States, a film crew arrived in Corning. Their assignment was to document and promote the city's more cultural aspects.
One day each June, the people of Corning celebrate a special event called Soundings, a festival of music of every kind, from the Corning Philharmonic to rock groups, folk singers, and barbershop quartets.
When the cooks in the kitchen had a tough time, your love would need a fight. You got a smile so sweet.
Soundings raises money that supports the arts in Corning. Everybody pitches in, and everybody enjoys it. Well, just about everybody.
The crew was scheduled to work through the week. They would end up being unable to leave and capturing on film the defining moment in the city's history.
Okay, we'll find your mama.
We got to get it together. We got to get it together. We got to get it together. Babe.
Our biggest memory was the Christmas parade, the Izzard Christmas parade. It was just a fabulous parade with floats and characters, and Santa came last. He'd stand in front of Izzard's, he'd speak to the crowd, he'd go up to the 3rd or 4th floor of Izzard's, and that's where his throne was for the entire Christmas season, and kids came to him. So this was our Macy's. Our New York Macy's was Izzard's.
Since the end of the 19th century, few cities in upstate New York boasted as energetic and vibrant a downtown as Elmira. Snuggled against the banks of the Chemung River, just 18 miles east of Corning, the eclectic array of shops and boutiques along Lake and Water Streets attracted thousands from across the region every year.
Mr. Peanut used to be out on the corner handing out peanuts. Izzard's was wonderful. You go down there for the brown bread and the salad. There were so many shops along both sides of Water Street as a youngster growing up and when I was a teenager. A lot to do.
It was a very special thing when you got to go to Elmira to go shopping. That was a time when there weren't malls. So, you went into a store and you had an old-fashioned elevator, and you often had somebody operating the elevator. And also, many of those stores had like tea rooms, and it was very special to go there and have lunch with your mother. So it was a really cool time to be growing up, I think.
I remember Elmira downtown as being a bustling, busy, active shopping area. So my friends from high school and I, Larry Stemmerman and Jonathan Allen, and I put together $150 each, and we opened a small shop in downtown Elmira. It was $50 a month rent, and we Painted it black. We called it People's Place. We sold jeans, candles, incense, really cool stuff. And we were in business.
Everybody wanted to wear clothes from the People's Place. I bought my first pair of bib overalls there. My first embroidered peasant shirt came from the People's Place.
It was the place to go. It was the place to go for jeans and anything new. We would go after school. There was something edgy about it enough that we never went alone. You always went with friends. How about that?
Throughout Elmira, on both sides of the river, were dozens of shops and factories producing everything from soda pop to typewriters and fire engines. The workers, mostly immigrants and their children, built their homes and neighborhoods within walking distance from their jobs, schools, and the downtown.
In the neighborhood where I grew up on the south side on Charles Street, it was a part of the Universal Village area. We had lots of Irish and Italian folks on the south side, and as you got to the north side, they perhaps were a bit more segmented in the areas they lived. You know, Upper North Main Street was the patch. That was where a lot of Italian families lived, and as you went a little further west, there were many more Polish families, and the kids we all went to school together, and we all knew whose dad worked where. We went every place on bicycles. We had lots of parkland. We played baseball a great deal in the summertime, and the family would go to Eldridge Park. And, it was really quite something in its day. And they had a wooden roller coaster. And even my mother talks about riding the wooden roller coaster. That was a big deal. And the whip, and boy, that was the place to be. They had talent shows and all manner of entertainment, and it was a big deal. To go there that was a big thing.
And of course, we were of a different generation of children who were actually allowed to roam. And so when I got my 25 or 50 cents allowance and headed out on a Saturday morning, I headed for downtown. I'd bounce up and down both sides of Water Street and go to the toy stores or the department stores. There was a water slide out in West Elmira, and the only rule of the proprietor was that you had to wear a bathing suit. And it was a big, long slide that came down out near Fitch's Bridge. And down in town, Clinton Island had hundreds of people who would go down to the island. The Rotary Club strung lights down there, and they had concession stands in the middle of the river.
Yeah, we just didn't give much thought to the river. It was there, and in the springtime there was high water, and my dad used to take us for a ride so we could look at the high water, and we never thought about it being a flood. It was just high water, and in the springtime there was high water because the snow melted and it rained, and on the flats along Maple Avenue and in big flats there was high water. But we never looked at it as a flood, never thought about that.
There was no perceived danger to any of us. It was a softer, gentler world for us.
No one in Elmira, Corning, Gang Mills, or dozens of other communities across New York and Pennsylvania would have ever imagined what was about to unfold for them or their communities.
The heavy rains and 80-mile-an-hour winds of Hurricane Agnes hit the northwest coast of Florida near Panama City today. Storm tides flooded streets and towns along a 50-mile stretch of the Florida coast. However, the storm began to dissipate rapidly, and there were no reports of any more deaths.
With winds barely over hurricane strength, Agnes's arrival on Monday night, June 19th, drew little attention during the evening news. By Tuesday morning, Agnes had been downgraded to a tropical depression as it passed over Georgia. Most forecasters predicted little more trouble from the weakening storm. They were wrong. The trouble was just beginning.
The problems really began Tuesday night. A cold front came through the eastern Great Lakes and stalled over western New York and started drawing moisture from Hurricane Agnes, which was still down in the Carolinas. And this moisture, this tropical moisture-laden air got drawn into this front that stalled over the Chemung Basin and the Allegheny Basin in western New York. And as much as 6 to 8 inches of rain fell overnight from Tuesday night to Wednesday morning as Agnes moved north into Virginia. That was a real problem because that got the Chemung River raging and all its tributaries.
Cattaraugus and Allegheny County, west of Elmira and Corning, took the bulk of the heavy rains overnight. Flash floods covered the streets in Olean and Hornell. Outside of Bath, a car was washed off the road and plunged into the Allegheny River. Its driver washed away. Across the region, rivers and streams that had been running low were rising fast.
And as all this was happening, the rain shield from Agnes was moving up into Pennsylvania. Now the heavy rains from Agnes itself reach in the afternoon. And to top that off, Agnes redeveloped back into a tropical storm as she moved off the New Jersey coast Wednesday during the day. And what happened was Agnes actually combined up with an upper level storm. And what this upper level storm did was pulled Agnes back to the west over Pennsylvania and just stalled out right on top of us. And then it just stayed over us for 2 more days. And Agnes rained herself out literally right over the Twin Tier region in Pennsylvania and western New York. And that was what really killed us.
Well, as I had mentioned, I was home from college and worked on a farm up in the Harris Hill area. And of course, late June was a time when we were trying to make hay and couldn't because it was so wet. And the streams on the farm began to be problematic because the cows would go to pasture and would have to go through these rain-swollen creeks.
Rained and rained and rained. You just never thought it was going to stop. And I remember I was at the Arnett working and it was just coming down. Everybody wanted to go home. They just wanted to go home. They were frightened. They wanted to go home. But it was the rain. I remember looking out the window and it was coming down in buckets.
We were on the bridge over the Cohocton River as a fire department looking for an individual that they had lost in the Bath area north of us someplace. And you think back of standing on that bridge watching the river rise every day, every night, looking for this individual.
At least 4 persons are missing here. It's been raining steadily now for 3 straight days. New York's Allegheny and Steuben counties are hardest hit, an area about 85 miles south of Buffalo. The Allegheny River alone has risen more than 16 feet since the rain began. Hundreds of acres of farmland washed away, thousands of homes underwater, hundreds of families evacuated. The towns of Olean and Salamanca have been taking the brunt of it. Some 7 inches of rain have fallen in the past 3 days, and it's being called the worst natural disaster in the area they've ever had. But it's not over yet. More rain is forecast for at least tonight and tomorrow, and the worst could get worse.
We were listening to the radio, and the mayor of Corning came on the radio and said that the dikes will hold and that there's no worry. And so we went to bed that evening thinking that all is safe and sound.
The official river forecasts were saying that the river should be able to handle the rainfall and the water would stay within bank. The river models back in those days did not take into account forecast rainfall. And that was a big problem. So they really didn't know it was going to be a big flood until all the rain was already pretty much down. So they really didn't have any really good warnings from the National Weather Service back in those days.
I don't think that you could possibly think what was going to happen on the night of the 22nd. That night, my brother and I had decided that we knew he lived in an area where he probably would be flooded. So we went over to his house and got some clothes out for the kids and some of the stuff out of the house. We left there after we had looked at the water coming up the dike behind his house. The water was about 2 inches from coming over. So we left there with an urgency that this is not too far away, we're going to be in trouble. On my way home, I drove through water. Well, what I didn't know at the time was that's when the water was coming into Gang Mills. It had just started in.
The dikes let go west of here. So our first water, I mean the first actual flood water that we got in town came from the west, which would have been the Tioga, the Canasteel, and the Kauneski.
It was rising feet a minute. It came in very rapidly and filled up Gang Mills very rapidly. I heard on the radio that Hobe Abbey, and Jack Keenley were in our brush buggy going to an area on Forest Drive where we were encouraging people to get out of their house. And that's what they got caught in. They got caught in that rush of water as it came into Gang Mills over the tracks on the western end of Gang Mills.
It was at that point that they called in their radio transmission is that they had flooded, the water had washed over the truck and flooded the engine, and they were stalled. And their last transmission was that they were getting out of the vehicle and they were going to get on top of it. And that was the last radio transmission that we had from them.
And they were on top of the brush buggy when the water got several feet deep and washed them off. And as it knocked them off the top of the truck, they floated down and through Gang Mills, and they got separated. Hobe went one way, Jack was slammed into a telephone pole, and Jack hung onto the telephone pole until daylight started to break, and he noticed the way the water was flowing around him and toward a house. He took a chance and swam to that house and got on top of the house and waited for rescue later in the day. Hobe, unfortunately, wasn't as lucky. He got caught up in the brush and trees.
By 2 a.m., nearly all of Gang Mills, including the fire department, was under as much as 12 feet of water. Next door, the Holiday Inn was inundated with over 700 refugees looking for shelter. Some of their neighbors never made it.
There were several deaths in the Gang Mills area. One person across from the fire station lived on the lower level of the house as the water came in. She was trapped down there. The firemen attempted to get down to her, couldn't. They even attempted to cut through the floor of the house to get to her, but couldn't. There was a baby in Gang Mills that drowned, was washed out of its mother's arms as the foundation of the house lifted. There were several people in cars that were found later.
The churning waters barreled into painted posts, knocking homes from their foundations and tossing sleeping owners onto flooded bedroom floors. The father and young daughter struggled desperately to escape the rising waters in their home, but failed and drowned. Within minutes, water covered painted post traffic circle, reaching second floors in the heart of the village. Those who made it to safety gathered on Grace Boulevard above the village.
that's where we stood, and we watched the water rise and get higher and higher. And I remember being there with other neighbors and other village residents, and it was still raining and it was drizzly, and I just remember it being quiet and everybody standing there and nobody speaking, just kind of in shock and watching the water rise.
The residents of Corning went to bed Thursday night with assurances from city officials that the dikes would hold and the city was in no danger. But by 1 a.m., all that had changed. A state of emergency had been declared across the city. By 3 a.m., the water began pouring over the 23-foot-high dike on Tioga Avenue. Residents along River and First Streets fled for higher ground. At 4 a.m., a wall of water, some say as high as 10 feet, slammed into the dikes protecting the downtown. They held, but only briefly.
You've got a levee, you're holding back all this water, and there's all this pressure on the levee. When it breaks, it just blasts right through like a fire hose, literally, and it just just leads to a major, it's like a dam break, really. So you just have this wall of water just blasting through Corning, and it just swept people away to their deaths.
The water rushed with incredible force through Market Street, the glass factories, and the museum. Streets and sidewalks began to buckle. One eyewitness later wrote, "I watched my house that I had escaped from just moments before be swept away like dust from a broom." The Penn Central Railroad Bridge, loaded with coal cars to brace it from the water's force, collapsed and plunged into the Chemung River. The entire downtown and industrial district was inundated within minutes.
I had the radio on just because I wanted to know what was happening, and all of a sudden it went off the air. So I poked Jerry. He was wearing a cast at the time. He had broken his ankle, and got the kids dressed up. And we went down and stood on the corner of Cedar and First Street. And the water's running down First Street, and the traffic signal's still working. And I'm saying, that's funny, there's no traffic. And it stopped. That's when the power went out.
All of us kind of gathered at that seashore, if you will, and it was just devastating because we could look down the street and you saw cars floating by, we saw a home float by, we saw caskets, you saw all kinds of debris, and you could hear people yelling, "Help!" But of course there was nothing we could do. So you kind of stood there helpless and really wondered, okay, what do we do now?
Dawn came pretty early, so I got up and drove down the hill. Once you made the bend, you could see the flood. I mean, you could see this brown, reflective water all over. And I pulled over in a very dangerous spot, and I just slept for about 3 hours. And I guess it was just pent up stuff, and then seeing it all and realizing what it's going to mean, what it did mean. It was a very tough time.
We were awakened by the sounds of bullhorns, and they were emergency vehicles going up and down the streets, telling people to get out of the houses, get their blankets, get their pillows, and go to Southside High School if they could not find another location. But they needed to leave the area immediately, and that's what we woke up to.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and the flood was hitting, and the sirens were going off. The law officers and the firemen were going through the streets with the sirens going.
About 2:30 or 3 o'clock that Friday morning, the fire sirens were sounded to summon us back to the fire station. And at that point, we began the evacuation of all of the south side of Elmira in the Maple Avenue area. And it was a door-to-door proposition where we walked and pounded on doors, blew fire truck sirens, made all the noise we could.
As daylight arrived Friday morning, Elmira was in chaos. Fire and police units continued to race through the city in a desperate attempt to clear the streets and neighborhoods before the onslaught of water that had destroyed Corning arrived from the west.
My friend Larry and I drove to the top of Harris Hill, and we looked down into the valley and actually saw the river beginning to crest. So we drove back to downtown Elmira. My family and friends all joined us, and because we were in a basement, we had to lift all the clothes up to the roof of this building. And within, I think, 3.5, 4 hours afterwards, the flood hit downtown Elmira big time.
We were asked to help evacuate some sheriff's vehicles from a garage on Pennsylvania Avenue. And as we were bringing those cars out, the river came over the flood wall. And as we drove up Pennsylvania Avenue away from that body shop, we could see in the rearview mirrors the flood coming behind us, which is a pretty scary feeling. It was shortly after that that the Walnut Street Bridge was washed away.
I saw that right after it happened, and that was a sight. This house was coming from Golden Glow and coming down the river, and everybody was panicking because they could see it going, and it hit the Walnut Street Bridge, and then the bridge just started falling. It was just it wasn't fun to watch. It was not fun.
There was a very strong current in some areas, and in fact, we had areas in Southport, 2 separate areas, where a good deal of destruction was caused by those floodwaters. They swept homes off the foundations and smashed them. They smashed into each other. We had roadways that were full of what was the remnants of houses. We had other areas where houses were just picked up and carried away.
We knew there was a possibility of flooding, but we weren't thinking in terms of the magnitude that actually occurred. We were thinking we might get a few feet of water in the basement at the very most. And it was just so shocking when all of a sudden, you know, within 2 hours, it was coming through the first floor of our house. My mother got out first because her elderly mother was with us. I stayed behind with my father. My brother was a volunteer fireman at the time, so he was helping out. And my father and I went out together in a little motorboat, and they literally took us down Main Street and up Canal Street until they could get us to a dump truck, and then they put us in a dump truck, and the dump truck drove us out of the rest of the water. I just remember being very grateful to see my mother after I got out of the dump truck. And that's where the family came back together.
downtown Elmira was literally wiped out. And we were the only store to save the merchandise.
I took a trip down Water Street, even though I wasn't supposed to be on the north side. I took a trip down Water Street in one of their boats, and you had to duck your head down to keep from hitting the red lights, traffic signals. I said, man, this is scary. The last phone call I got before my phone went dead was, you're back on duty. You're in charge of the south side of Elmira from 6 o'clock till 6 in the morning. 12 on, no days off. Good luck.
It was a mess. Throughout that day, there was not a whole lot of anything that could be done except transport people out of the way and keep people out of the area. So we just kind of hunkered down and waited, and in anticipation that the water would come up and the water would go down, and in the aftermath we were going to have to deal with whatever went on.
Good evening. We've got a major disaster along the East Coast because of Tropical Storm Agnes, which has turned out to be more dangerous than anyone had expected. There is other news, but none of it as important as this storm. The U.S. Weather Bureau believes the flooding from the Gulf Coast to New York is the most geographically extensive in the country's history. It is still raining in most places from the Carolinas to New York State, and Pennsylvania has been especially hard hit. This afternoon, President Nixon declared Florida, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York disaster areas. Rivers throughout the area are flooding: the Potomac, Ohio, Allegheny, Susquehanna, Monongahela, and Schuylkill, and in Virginia, the James River is higher than it's ever been. Cities which have been flooded are Richmond, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Wilkes-Barre. Wilkes-Barre had been evacuated. And in New York State, Corning, Olean, and Elmira are the most seriously affected. They have plans for letting convicts out of Attica State Prison to help with rescue work.
By the time the rain stopped falling Friday evening, Tropical Storm Agnes had wrought havoc on 15 states. Over 135,000 homes had been flooded, nearly 15,000 of them completely destroyed. Over 10,000 schools, churches, farms, and businesses had been damaged. Thousands of miles of rail lines and hundreds of bridges had been completely washed away. And 125 people were dead. With nearly $4 billion in damage, it was at the time the most widespread and costly natural disaster in American history. Agnes had been particularly brutal to Pennsylvania, where more than 18 inches of rain had fallen in some areas. Over 250,000 residents were forced to flee. Many would never be able to return to the homes they left. The list of cities and towns underwater was staggering. Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Athens, Wellsburg, Tioga, Mansfield, Towanda, the list went on and on. In New York, the full extent of the disaster was just becoming clear. Olean, Wellsville, Salamanca, Hornell, and Bath were all devastated. In Steuben County, Agnes was most deadly. A grim house-to-house search would reveal the true horror of the disaster. 25 people were dead, including Gang Mill's assistant fire chief, Hobart Abbey.
He was very well known, not just in our community, but countywide, because he was very active in the County Firemen's Association, as well as being a deputy fire coordinator for the county under Leo Jacobus. So the entire fire service organization felt his loss.
The city of Corning had been transformed into a surreal junkyard, with cars, houses, clothing, and other debris scattered across lawns and porches. The entire downtown had been inundated. Virtually every business along Market Street had been flooded. Corning Hospital and over a dozen schools in the area were severely damaged. The mammoth furnaces of the glass factory were in ruin. Scores of other industries and shops were turned to rubble. Whole neighborhoods were destroyed, their streets littered with the heartbreaking evidence of devastated lives. Inside the Corning Glass Museum, where the water had risen to over 5 feet, evidence of the disaster was everywhere.
What had happened was that the cases had filled with water. And as they filled with water, the pedestals floated because they were wood, and the glasses fell off and filled with water and came down. So you had these glasses all kind of helter-skelter. But then, as the waters receded, these blocks came down, and they were heavy, and they crushed the glass. So it was a real, and I think the worst moment for me was going down under the water to try to get some of the rare books out. And of course, the rare books were all vellum and animal glues, and they'd all come apart, and they were all slimy, and here's Josephus and Agricola and Herodotus, and it was terrible. Yeah, it was terrible.
The devastation in Elmira was even more widespread. Of its 40,000 residents, over half of them were forced from their homes. Whole streets and neighborhoods built by first-generation Americans nearly a century ago were wiped away. St. Joseph's Hospital, the Steele Memorial Library, Dunn Field, and Eldridge Park were all badly flooded. But remarkably, not a single life in Elmira was lost.
It was just total devastation everywhere.
It was a real difficult time to see the devastating loss for so many businesses, so many homes, so many families.
There were some neighborhoods that were pretty well wiped out. There are areas on the south side in the Rathbun Street, Falk Street area that houses were just gone.
Everyone I knew, most everyone I knew, lost everything.
Thick and putrid layers of mud covered lawns, porches, and basements in block after block across the city. The Walnut Street Bridge lay in pieces. The downtown, that for so many generations was the jewel of the Queen City, was destroyed. From every part of the country, help poured in.
People that lived not only in this vicinity, but far away, they made it their business to come to help. And they forgot about whether we were, what denomination, if you were Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Pentecostal, that was not a point. It was responding to human needs. And they came in a big way from all over.
My name is Leonard Suttle. I'm from New York City. People had no water when we came here at all, nothing to drink, nothing to cook with, or anything like that, not even to take a shower or a bath, forget about it. They didn't have any clean water here at all when we first came. And we're doing our best to supply them with water, drinking water, whatever they need. As long as they need us, I think we'll be here.
The National Guard was out and other help from the state. And it took place on the level of our federal government, with Housing and Urban Development sending in hundreds, if not thousands, of trailers for people in Elmira and in Corning to live in. And then, of course, there were the voluntary organizations, the Red Cross, the Mennonite Disaster Service. If they hadn't come in and worked so hard, donating their time, donating their support, then a lot of this never would have been done, or at least it would have taken a much longer time to get done.
Agnes, she started small. Then she went to town. Towns like Richmond and Harrisburg, Wheeling and Elmira. She killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands suffered. The Red Cross needs well over $10 million right now for flood relief all across the country. This is Richard Kiley urging you to help. Send money now to the American National Red Cross, Washington, D.C.
The WCLI and WCBA Emergency Flood Network is pleased to present at this time a special statement by Amory Houghton, Jr., Chairman of Corning Glass Works. Mr. Houghton.
Thank you, George. Other than mourning were the families who have lost almost 20 people at the latest count. It really is still too early to assess the loss, both in human lives and in property. But several things come quite clear. This was a disaster of the first order for our community. Possibly the worst flood in its intensity ever to hit our part of the world. Every single person I've talked to has not only been full of sorrow, obviously great sorrow, but also full of determination. And this, of course, is the underlying spirit upon which all hope for this community is based. We're not licked, we're going to bounce back, and for many, we're going to start again.
The company formed up very fast. Emil was the CEO. They made sure that the communication was set up as soon as it could be by radio. They made sure that that water was going to come down from a brewery somewhere. I mean, they just handled everything, and of course they were used to it. They were used to designating to people, okay, this is going to be your task, here it simply is the way you do it, there's a time you've got, and so on.
It was the people who'd lived and gone to school here and worked here all their lives. They're the ones that came to the fore and ran the place. And you once again appreciated the value and the depth and the decency of these people and the capabilities. They were just terrific.
The guy that organized the YES program, Youth Emergency Service, was Cam Rutledge. And all of our kids were involved in that. They were trained very quickly. What do you do to get the motor on a refrigerator going again? You know, what do you do to clean up these things, like how do you get a vacuum cleaner started again? Where do you put rugs when you take them out of the house? What's worth drying, what's worth rolling up to be picked up, you know, when it can be. So they were well trained, all these kids.
They're going to clean out the garage and hose off the stuff. And I don't know what else, but I'm certainly grateful for them.
My name is Lindsay Davidson. I normally live in Boston, Massachusetts, and work at the Museum of Fine Arts in the music room. People are working down at the museum rescuing glass, people are working at the college rescuing slides, and we're rescuing all the photographs possible. And these photographs are from the collection here and those of all over the world.
I decided that we were going to reopen the Glass Center within 2 weeks or 3 weeks, something very short, maybe it was a month. I thought that we ought to just get back to business as quickly as we could and not sit around being sorry for each other. So that was our motivation at the museum, and we did it. We got back open very quickly.
While all these clothing stores and boutiques and gift shops and restaurants were all wiped out, we were the only store in town with dry merchandise. The Red Cross came in right away. They handed people coupons to cash in to buy clothes or whatever they needed. And we rented a space up on Rowe Avenue and College Avenue near Elmira College as a temporary store, sold all of our clothes out in a day, drove to New York City, packed up vans full of merchandise, brought them back, and we were selling clothes to people who had lost everything.
See, I'm patriotic. I've had the flag out every day. We've had a major disaster, and we're taking it like normal American people, trying to do our best. What else can you do?
The house was just hanging on like one column of rocks in that corner after the flood. But I think the weight of the house kept the house from really moving. We're getting a few cracks in the plaster inside now, but not too bad. So the house is on jacks, and we'll be able to make it, you know, come back and put it back together. I think about the future here because this is where our past is, and we've had a lot of good years around here.
My brothers and I lived in the trailer on the side of the house with my parents, and my sisters were able to, when the house was converted enough, able to sleep upstairs. And so it took us well over a year before it was all settled so that we were able to move back in.
One of the things that is the most vivid in terms of memory for me is how everybody came together. All of a sudden we were one huge community. We weren't a small town anymore, and we all had suffered some sort of loss, some much greater than others. I think it's just about how it shapes your character and how you felt like you survived something really amazing.
In the months and years that followed the disaster, every community in Agnes' path began to move forward. In Corning, the movement to resurrect Market Street, already in place before the floods, continued with renewed energy. Many of the buildings throughout the downtown, though badly damaged, were saved and became an integral part of the recovery of the city.
The flood of 1972 was a really great example of what you can do with historic buildings, even in the face of the terrible conditions that existed after the flood. But people's eyes were on Corning, New York, because this had never really happened before. No one had really thought of preservation as a good tool to economically revitalize a downtown. So people in Corning feel proud of their city. They feel proud that their city was able to recover the way that it did. They also feel very grateful to Corning Incorporated, which at the time was Corning Glass, for the support that it gave for the recovery. In Elmira, where I was first exposed to flood stories, the before and after is the opposite sort of story.
I really believe that the flood of '72 was a turning point for Elmira, because Elmira went from being this industrious, lively, great town to a depressed town.
After Agnes, Elmira struggled badly. Old neighborhoods never recovered. Much of the industrial base that had driven the city's economy for generations began to fade away. And the once vibrant downtown quickly became a victim of the floods, a new mall, and urban renewal.
The urban renewal part of it, the renewal part never came. All these buildings were demolished, but it became green space, and a lot of the commercial area was lost.
All of the storefronts on the river side of Water Street were simply removed from Main Street to Lake. And when you look at the photographs, it's just all of this jumble of signage and storefronts and people and all kinds of activity and trolleys or cars, all kinds of stuff going on. And now, there's nothing there.
40 years after Agnes, Elmira's recovery continues to evolve, with, like Corning before it, a renewed affection for the treasures of its past.
I do think that there is a parallel between where Corning was 40 years ago and where Elmira is today, and that Corning used the flood as a way to reimagine itself, and that Elmira can reimagine itself. It can envision a different future for itself than it might otherwise have.
All towns have to continually reinvent themselves and refine themselves. Well, that's all right, we can do that. Things will not be the same as they were before, but things have never been the same as they were before. And so Elmira, Corning, Binghamton, all of our towns are always reinventing themselves and need to reinvent themselves. I guess part of the key is to do it deliberately and to do it with foresight.
For many years, you looked back at events that had taken place, in prior time, as to before the flood, after the flood. Because life was really totally different after the flood because of the events of the flood. Many people lost homes, many people lost lives. So that generation, that's a milestone in life. Future generations, our kids' generations, they all had events that were probably stick in their mind as major. And I guess we learned from all of them. We learned how to react to those things and go on.
Production support for Agnes, the Flood of '72, has been provided by the Corning Incorporated Foundation, the Community Foundation of Elmira Corning and the Finger Lakes, and by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.